The air in the great hall of the conservatory felt heavy, like the weight of 100 years of music was pressing down on everyone inside. It was a beautiful room, with high, arched ceilings and polished wooden floors that gleamed under the soft lights. The grand piano on stage looked like a sleek black beast, silent and waiting. For the students in the audience, this was more than just a room. It was a battlefield where their musical dreams were either celebrated or crushed. And today, it was her turn. She sat on the smooth, cool bench, her fingers resting lightly on the ivory keys. She had just finished playing a piece by Chopin, a nocturne that she loved with all her heart. It was a piece full of deep, quiet feelings, a story of love and sadness told through music. As she played the last soft note, she held her breath, letting the sound fade into the silent hall. For a brief, shining moment, she felt a flicker of pride. She had put her soul into that performance, trying to make the piano sing the way she felt it in her dreams. She hoped they could hear it too. She hoped they could feel the story, but as the final echo disappeared, she knew it hadn't been perfect. Her heart sank a little as she remembered a small fumble in the middle section, a couple of notes that had come out just a little too fast, a little too clumsy. To anyone else, it might have been nothing, a tiny imperfection in a sea of beautiful music. But to her, it felt like a crack in a vase, a small flaw that ruined the whole thing. She could feel her cheeks getting warm, and she wished she could go back in time and play those few bars again, just to make them right. Then the silence was broken. It wasn't applause. It was the sound of a single, quiet cough from the front row. All eyes, including hers, turned to the man sitting there. He was the head of the piano department, a man with a reputation for being as tough and unyielding as granite. He was older, with silver hair combed neatly back, and he wore small, round spectacles that sat on the end of his nose. He didn't look at her with anger, but with something that felt even worse, a cold, disappointed calm. He held a pen in his hand, tapping it lightly on a notebook, and the small tap-tap-tap was the only sound in the enormous room. He let the silence stretch on for what felt like an eternity. She could feel her own heartbeat in her throat, a fast, frantic drum against her skin. She watched as he slowly took off his spectacles, cleaned them with a cloth from his pocket, and put them back on. Every small, deliberate movement made her feel smaller and more exposed. Finally he spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp and clear, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Passionate," he said, his eyes fixed on her. The word hung in the air for a moment, and she felt a tiny spark of hope. But then he continued. "But sloppy. You hide behind emotion because your fingers lack the discipline to serve your heart." Each word was a small, precise jab. He wasn't just criticizing her performance. He was telling her that her feelings, the very things she poured into her music, were a weakness, something she used to cover up her failures. She felt the heat in her cheeks turn into a burning fire of humiliation. She wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor and vanish. She could hear a few students shifting in their seats, and she could feel their pitying stares on her. It was one thing to fail quietly in a practice room, but it was another thing entirely to have your flaws pointed out so publicly, so brutally. But the man wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intensifying. "You wish to be considered a serious pianist, don't you?" he asked, though it sounded more like a statement than a question. She could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. "Then you must conquer technique. You must prove that your hands can be as strong as your spirit." He paused again, letting his words sink in. Then he issued the challenge. "Return in 1 month," he said, his voice flat and final, "and you will play Liszt's La Campanella." A collective, audible gasp rippled through the hall. It was as if he had just asked her to fly. La Campanella wasn't just a difficult piece. It was a legend at the conservatory, a monster of a song that only the most advanced, technically perfect students ever dared to attempt. It was famous for its lightning-fast jumps, its delicate, bell-like notes that had to be played with incredible speed and precision. It was the musical equivalent of climbing Mount Everest, and he had just told a first-year student who struggled with a Chopin nocturne to do it. Until then, he added, his voice dripping with dismissal, Don't waste our time with pretty feelings. The words hit her like a physical blow. Waste our time, that's all her passion, her soul, her music was to him, a waste. She felt her eyes start to sting, and she fought back the tears with every ounce of strength she had. She would not cry. Not here. Not in front of everyone. She could feel the eyes of every student and teacher on her, a mixture of shock, pity, and even a little bit of cruel curiosity. They were all waiting to see what she would do. Slowly, her hands trembling, she began to gather her sheet music from the stand. The papers felt flimsy and fragile in her shaking fingers. She could hear the rustle of the papers, and it sounded incredibly loud in the dead silence of the hall. She stood up from the piano bench, her legs feeling weak and unsteady. She gave a small, clumsy nod to the faculty, not daring to look at the man who had just torn her apart in front of everyone. Then, she turned and walked off the stage. Each step felt like a mile. The journey from the piano to the side door was the longest walk of her life. She could feel the weight of 100 stairs on her back, and she imagined them all whispering about her, about the girl who had been publicly shamed, the girl who had been given an impossible task. She didn't look up. She just kept her eyes on the floor, counting the wooden floorboards until she finally reached the door. Her hand closed around the cool, metal doorknob, and she pulled it open, stepping out of the blinding light of the stage and into the cool, dark shadows of the wings. As the door swung shut behind her, blocking out the silent hall, she finally let out a breath she didn't even know she was holding. It came out as a shaky, broken sob, and she leaned against the wall, sliding down to the floor as the tears she had fought so hard to hold back finally began to fall. The door to the wings closed behind her with a soft, final click, shutting out the stage lights and the silent judgment of the hall. But the silence didn't bring peace. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket, and for a moment she just stood there, her back pressed against the cool, rough wall of the corridor. The tears she had been holding back finally broke free, not in quiet sobs, but in great, racking gasps that shook her entire body. She slid down the wall, her legs giving out from under her, and curled into a small ball on the floor. The polished floorboards were cold against her cheek, but she didn't care. All she could feel was the burning shame in her chest and the echo of his words in her mind, sloppy. Lacks discipline? Waste our time, She didn't know how long she sat there in the dim, narrow hallway. It could have been minutes, or it could have been an hour. The world outside her own little bubble of misery had ceased to exist. Eventually, the storm of tears passed, leaving her feeling hollow and empty, like a shell washed up on a beach. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, her skin feeling sticky and tight. She knew she couldn't stay there forever. Slowly, unsteadily, she pushed herself up and began the long walk back to her small dorm room at the far end of the building. The walk was a blur. She kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the worn pattern in the carpet, not wanting to see anyone, not wanting to see the pity or the triumph in their eyes. She could hear the faint sounds of music coming from behind the closed doors of the practice rooms. She passed a soaring violin, a melancholy cello, a lively flute. Normally, these sounds would have been a comfort, a reminder of the beautiful world she was a part of. But tonight, they felt like accusations. Each perfect note, each effortless run, was a testament to everything she was not. Finally, she reached her room. It was a small, simple space with just a bed, a desk, and a small upright piano tucked into the corner. It was her sanctuary, but tonight it felt like a prison cell. She didn't even turn on the main light, just the small lamp on her desk, which cast a weak, yellow glow over the room. She dropped her bag on the floor and stood in the middle of the room. Feeling lost, her eyes fell on the stack of sheet music on her desk. On top was the new piece, the one he had assigned. La Campanella. She had a copy of it, of course. Everyone at the conservatory did. It was like a mythical creature, something you heard about but never actually saw up close. With a sense of dread, she walked over to the desk and picked it up. The paper felt crisp and heavy in her hands. She carried it over to the piano and sat down on the bench. The same bench she had sat on 100 times before, but it felt different now. It felt like an electric chair. She spread the sheet music on the stand. And she stared. It was worse than she had ever imagined. The page was not just covered in notes. It was swarming with them. It looked like 1,000 black insects had crawled all over the paper and died there. There were so many notes, packed so tightly together that they seemed to be moving, writhing on the page. The famous jumps were marked with huge, terrifying arcs that spanned most of the keyboard. How was a single hand supposed to move that far, that fast, and land on the right note every time? It wasn't just music. It was a cruel joke. A trick. She took a deep breath and placed her fingers on the keys. Her hands felt stiff and clumsy, like they belonged to someone else. She tried to play the first few bars. It was a disaster. Her fingers, which usually felt so connected to her thoughts, felt like sausages. They fumbled, they tripped, they landed with loud, ugly thuds instead of the light, sparkling sound the piece demanded. The little bell theme, which was supposed to sound delicate and clear, came out as a series of disjointed, ugly clunks. She stopped, her heart pounding with frustration. She tried again, and again, and again. Each attempt was worse than the last. The more she tried to force her fingers to move faster, the more they refused. It was like they were rebelling against her. She could feel the muscles in her forearms tightening, a dull ache starting to throb in her wrists. An hour passed, then 2. The room grew darker, the only light the small lamp casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The world outside her window went to sleep, but she was wide awake. Trapped in this nightmare of black notes and wrong sounds, the frustration began to curdle into anger. She slammed her fingers down on the keys, producing a harsh, discordant crash that echoed in the small room. "I can't," she yelled out loud, her voice raw with emotion. The sound of her own voice in the silent room startled her. She looked at her hands, resting on the keys as if they were strangers. They were the same hands that had coaxed beautiful melodies from the piano, the same hands that had brought her so much joy. But now they felt like her enemies. She thought about his words again. You hide behind emotion because your fingers lack discipline. Was he right? Had she been fooling herself all this time? Maybe she wasn't a gifted musician. Maybe she was just a girl with a lot of feelings who could sort of play the piano. The doubt was a cold, creeping thing, seeping into her bones and freezing her from the inside out. She thought about the other students, the ones she could hear practicing through the walls. She imagined them in their rooms, their fingers flying across the keys, their faces calm and focused. They didn't struggle like this. They didn't fail like this. The thought of quitting, which had been a tiny whisper in the back of her mind, now grew into a loud shout. What was the point? She could go back home. She could study something else, something normal. She could work in a shop or in an office. She could have a life where she didn't have to feel this constant, crushing pressure. The thought was almost a relief. It was like a door opening in a dark, stuffy room, letting in a breath of fresh air. She stood up so abruptly that the piano bench scraped against the floor. She reached out and slammed the lid of the piano shut. The sound was final, like a coffin lid closing. She grabbed the sheet music from the stand, crumpled it into a tight, angry ball in her fist, and threw it across the room. It hit the wall and fell to the floor, a sad, white lump of paper. She stood in the middle of the room, breathing heavily, her hands clenched into fists. She was done. She wouldn't go back. She wouldn't face him again. She would just pack her bags and leave in the morning. The decision filled her with a strange, hollow sense of peace. She walked over to her bed and lay down, fully dressed, on top of the covers. She stared at the ceiling, her mind completely empty. The silence in the room was absolute. For the first time all night, there was no music, no discordant notes, no frustrated sighs. There was nothing. And in that nothing she felt a profound and terrifying loneliness. She had given up. She had let him win. And as she lay there in the dark, a single, hot tear escaped from the corner of her eye and traced a slow path down her temple, disappearing into her hair. She wasn't sure if it was a tear of sadness or of regret. The morning light came through the window, not with a gentle warmth, but with a harsh, gray glare that made everything in the small room look tired and sad. She opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling. For a moment, she didn't remember anything. Then, like a wave crashing over her, the memory of the previous night came flooding back. The humiliation in the great hall, the cold words of the teacher, the terrifying page of black notes, and finally the angry, hopeless act of slamming the piano lid shut. She sat up, her body stiff and aching from sleeping in her clothes. Her eyes fell on the crumpled ball of paper lying in the corner of the room. La Campanella. It looked like a dead bird. A feeling of heavy resignation settled in her chest. The decision she had made in the dark of night felt clear and simple in the light of day. She would leave. It was over. She swung her legs off the bed and stood up, her feet cold on the wooden floor. She walked over to her small closet and pulled out her suitcase. She began to pull her clothes from the drawers, not folding them, just stuffing them into the case in a messy heap. Each piece of clothing she threw in felt like a small victory against the pressure, a step back to a normal life where she didn't have to feel like a failure. But as she was packing, her hand brushed against her old, worn songbook. It was a simple book of folk songs she had learned as a child, long before she had ever dreamed of a conservatory. Without thinking, she picked it up and carried it over to the piano. She sat down, the suitcase still open and half full on the floor behind her. She didn't open the book. She didn't need to. She knew these songs by heart. She placed her fingers on the keys and played a simple melody. It was a lullaby, a song her mother used to sing to her. The notes were simple and pure, and as she played, she felt a tiny bit of the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. She wasn't trying to be perfect. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was just playing. After she finished the lullaby, she played another song and then another. She played for almost an hour, just letting the music flow out of her. It was the first time since the master class that she had played without feeling a knot of fear in her stomach. And then she stopped. Her fingers rested on the keys, and she found herself thinking about La Campanella, not with fear, but with a strange sense of curiosity. What was it about that piece? What was the secret that everyone else seemed to know but her? An idea, small and fragile, began to form in her mind. She had been trying to conquer the piece, to fight it into submission. What if that was the wrong way? What if, instead of fighting it, she tried to understand it? She stood up and walked over to the corner. She picked up the crumpled ball of sheet music and carefully smoothed it out on her desk. She looked at the storm of notes, but this time she didn't see an enemy. She saw a puzzle. She decided she wouldn't try to play it. Not yet. First, she would listen. She put on her headphones and sat at her desk, her old laptop humming to life. She searched for recordings of La Campanella. She found dozens of them. She listened to one, then another. They were all fast, incredibly fast. The pianist's fingers were a blur, a whirlwind of sound that was impressive but also cold and intimidating. It was like watching a machine, perfect and soulless. She could hear the technical skill, but she couldn't feel the music. It just sounded like a lot of very difficult, very fast notes. This wasn't helping. This was just making her feel more hopeless. She was about to give up when she stumbled upon a very old recording, a video from a black and white television broadcast. The pianist was an old man with a kind face and wild white hair. He didn't look like a virtuosic superstar. He looked like a grandfather who was about to tell you a wonderful story. She clicked play and the music began. It was fast, yes, but it was different. There was a clarity to it, a sense of space. And then she heard it. The bell, the campanella. It wasn't just a high-pitched note lost in the storm. It was a character. It was a tiny silver bell ringing out with a mischievous, joyful laugh, dancing playfully above the chaos of the other notes. The old man wasn't just showing off his speed. He was having a conversation with the bell. The fast, complicated passages were the elaborate, exciting setting for this beautiful, sparkling jewel. He was telling a story, not just running a race. She listened to that recording over and over again. She closed her eyes and just let the sound wash over her. She wasn't thinking about the jumps or the technique anymore. She was just listening to the bell, following its happy dance through the music. A spark ignited inside her. She knew what she had to do. She walked back to the piano, leaving the headphones on the desk. She didn't look at the full score. She found the page with the main theme, the part with the bell. She ignored all the other notes, the fast runs and the complicated chords. She focused only on that single, repeating high note. She played it once. It was just a note. She played it again, this time trying to make it sound clearer, more like a real bell. She spent the rest of the day doing just that, playing that one note over and over. She experimented with how hard to press the key, how to lift her finger to make it ring, how to use the pedal to let the sound hang in the air just for a moment before it faded away. It wasn't a practice session. It was a meditation. She was searching for the soul of that one note. The next day she did the same thing. And the day after that. Slowly, she began to feel a connection. The note was no longer just a sound. It was a feeling, a personality. It was playful, a little bit cheeky, and full of light. Once she felt she could make that bell sing, she began to add the other notes back in, one by one. The big jumps didn't seem so scary anymore because she knew she was jumping towards that happy little bell. The fast arpeggios weren't just a jumble of notes. They were the wind that made the bell chime. She was no longer fighting the music. She was working with it, searching for its heart. And little by little, the impossible piece was starting to feel less like a wall and more like a door, and she was finally beginning to find the key. The month passed in a blur of focused, quiet work. The small room with the upright piano was no longer a prison, but a laboratory, a sanctuary. She stopped thinking about the challenge, the teacher, or the audience. Her world shrank until it contained only her, the piano, and the joyful, ringing sound of the little bell. She practiced until her fingers knew the path without her mind having to tell them. Until the huge jumps felt as natural as breathing. Until the storm of notes was no longer a storm but a familiar, exhilarating dance. The day of the performance arrived. It was strange, but she didn't feel the paralyzing fear she had felt a month ago. There was a nervous energy, a fluttering in her stomach, but it was different. It was the feeling you get before you open a gift you've been waiting for, not the feeling you get when you're about to be punished. As she walked down the long corridor towards the great hall, her steps were light and sure. She saw other students, and they smiled at her, their eyes filled with encouragement instead of pity. She was no longer the girl who had been publicly shamed. She was just another musician, about to share a piece of music she had come to love deeply. She waited in the wings, the same place where she had crumbled into a heap of tears a month ago. But this time she stood tall. She could hear the murmur of the audience settling into their seats, a low, gentle hum like a distant ocean. Through the small crack in the curtain, she could see the rows of people, and in the front row, the faculty. She saw the head of the department, the man who had issued the challenge. He was looking at the program in his hands, his expression unreadable. She felt no anger towards him, only a quiet sense of gratitude. His harsh words had pushed her to a place she never would have gone on her own. Then her name was called. She took one last, deep breath and walked out onto the stage. The lights were bright, but they didn't blind her. They felt warm, like an embrace. The walk to the piano was familiar, but it felt completely different. She was not the same person who had shuffled off this stage with her head bowed. She was a musician with a story to tell. She sat down on the smooth, cool bench and ran her hands lightly over the keys, a silent greeting to an old friend. The hall fell into a deep, expectant silence. It was so quiet she could hear the soft ticking of a clock somewhere in the back of the room. She didn't rush. She closed her eyes for just a moment, picturing the old man from the black and white video, his kind face, his joyful approach to the music. She wasn't there to conquer a monster. She was there to let a little silver bell sing. She placed her fingers on the keys and began. The opening notes were clear and confident, not loud but full of purpose. They filled the hall with a sense of quiet anticipation. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats, surprised by the calm authority in her playing. This was not the nervous, hesitant girl they remembered. Then she reached the first series of jumps. Her right hand lifted from the keys and seemed to float through the air before landing with a light, sparkling precision. The notes were not just correct, they had a life to them. They were like tiny, perfect diamonds scattered on black velvet, and then it happened. The first campanella, the high, clear note rang out, and it was as if someone had hung a tiny, perfectly crafted silver bell in the center of the hall and struck it with a tiny hammer. The sound was pure, crystalline, and it hung in the air with a magical, shimmering quality. A collective, almost inaudible sigh went through the audience. It was a sound of pure wonder. They weren't just hearing a piano. They were hearing a bell. She had found its voice. From that moment on, she was no longer on the stage. She was inside the music. Her fingers flew across the keys with an effortless grace that was breathtaking to watch. The huge, terrifying jumps that had haunted her for weeks were now playful leaps, her hand moving in a smooth, elegant arc from one end of the keyboard to the other. She wasn't fighting the distance. She was dancing with it. The fast, swirling passages were no longer a chaotic storm of notes, but a beautiful, intricate tapestry of sound. She was weaving the music around the central theme of the bell, making it shine and sparkle against a rich, colorful background. Her face, which had been a mask of fear and concentration a month ago, was now soft and expressive. Her eyes were closed, her head tilted slightly to the side, as if she were listening to a secret only she could hear. She was completely lost in the world of the music, a world of joy, mischief, and breathtaking beauty. The audience was with her, completely captivated. They leaned forward in their seats, their breathing shallow, not wanting to miss a single note. The faculty in the front row, the stern, critical faces she remembered, were now masks of astonishment. The head of the department had put down his program and was staring at her. His mouth slightly agape. The music built towards its final, dramatic climax. The notes came faster and faster, a whirlwind of sound that was both powerful and controlled. Her hands were a blur of motion, a storm of energy on the keyboard. Then, with a final, triumphant flourish, she played the last series of chords. They were not just loud, they were resonant, full, and they seemed to shake the very foundations of the hall. The final chord hung in the air, a bold, definitive statement. And then it began to fade, slowly, slowly, until there was nothing left but a faint, ghostly echo, and then there was silence. It wasn't the polite, expectant silence that usually follows a performance. It was a deep, profound, breathless silence. The entire hall was frozen, as if time had stopped. No one moved. No one spoke. They were all still under the spell of the music she had created. She sat at the piano, her hands resting on the keys, her chest rising and falling with each deep breath. A single drop of sweat trickled down her temple, but she didn't notice. She was still in the world of the music, waiting for the last echo of the bell to fade completely away. The silence stretched on, 3 seconds, 5, 10. It was a silence filled with more emotion than any applause could ever be. It was the sound of 100 hearts, all beating in awe. The silence in the great hall was a living thing. It was not an empty silence, but a full one, thick with the ghost of the final chord and the stunned amazement of everyone who had just witnessed something extraordinary. She sat at the piano, her fingers still resting on the keys, her body frozen in the posture of the final note. Her mind was a complete blank. All the worry, all the practice, all the fear of the past month had been burned away by the fire of the performance, leaving behind a strange, quiet emptiness. She was aware of the lights on her face, the weight of the air, and the sound of her own heart beating a slow, steady rhythm in her chest. She was not thinking about the audience or the teachers. She was just floating in the beautiful, fading echo of the music. Then, from the very back of the hall, a single sound broke the spell. It was the clear, distinct sound of one person clapping. It was a hesitant sound, almost a question, as if the person wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do. In the profound silence, it sounded as loud as a gunshot. A second later, another person joined in, then a third. It was like the first few drops of a coming rainstorm. Then suddenly the dam broke. A wave of sound erupted from the audience, a roar of applause so loud and so powerful that it felt like a physical force. It wasn't just clapping. It was a collective expression of awe, a release of all the tension and emotion they had been holding inside, and then they began to stand. One person, then another, then a whole row, until the entire hall was on its feet. A standing ovation. It was something she had only ever seen in movies, something she had dreamed about but never truly believed would happen to her. The sound of hundreds of people clapping, their faces turned towards her, was overwhelming. A hot, stinging tear welled up in her eye, and then another, tracing a path down her cheek. She wasn't crying from sadness or even from happiness. It was a release, a letting go of all the pain and frustration of the past month. She slowly lifted her hands from the keys and turned to face the audience. The blur of faces and the blinding lights were a surreal, dreamlike vision. She saw their mouths moving, but she couldn't hear what they were saying over the thunderous applause. She could only see the admiration and the wonder in their eyes. She pushed herself up from the piano bench, her legs feeling shaky and weak as if they might not hold her. She took a small, wobbly bow. The applause grew even louder. She straightened up, a shaky, incredulous smile on her face. She bowed again, deeper this time, a genuine, heartfelt gesture of gratitude. She wanted to thank every single person in that room, not just for their applause, but for listening, for truly hearing the music she had worked so hard to understand. She took one final bow and then, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over her, she turned and walked off the stage, the roar of the crowd following her into the wings, the moment she was out of sight. She leaned against the wall, her body trembling. The cool, dim air of the wings was a stark contrast to the bright heat of the stage. She could still hear the applause, a muffled, rumbling sound from beyond the curtain. A few other students who were waiting to go on or had just performed stood nearby, their eyes wide. They didn't say anything at first. They just looked at her, their expressions a mixture of shock and reverence. Then, a girl from the violin section, someone she had always admired from a distance, walked over and simply wrapped her in a hug. It was a silent, powerful gesture of understanding and respect. That was... The girl started, then shook her head, unable to find the words. That was just incredible. She managed a weak smile. Thank you. She spent the next few minutes in a happy daze, accepting quiet congratulations and pats on the back from her peers. The feeling was not one of pride, but of belonging. For the first time since she had arrived at the conservatory, she felt like she was truly a part of this world. Not just an outsider trying to get in. As the excitement began to die down and the next performer was introduced, she decided to gather her things and leave. She wanted to be alone with her thoughts, to process what had just happened. She walked through the quiet, empty corridors towards the main exit. The building, which had felt so oppressive and intimidating just a few hours ago, now felt like a place of possibility. As she reached the large, wooden doors of the main entrance, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see the head of the piano department walking towards her. Her heart gave a little flutter of the old fear, but it was quickly replaced by a calm curiosity. He stopped in front of her, and for a moment they just looked at each other. His face was not stern or cold. It was thoughtful, almost gentle. He didn't offer any flowery compliments or a dramatic apology. That wasn't his way. He looked her straight in the eye, his gaze clear and direct. "I was wrong about you," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The words were simple, but, coming from him, they meant more than any standing ovation. He paused, as if considering his next words carefully. "You didn't just conquer the piece," he continued. "You taught us something about it. You found its heart." He gave her a small, slow nod of respect, a gesture that was more powerful and meaningful than 1,000 words. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, a profound sense of peace settling over her. She pushed open the heavy doors and stepped out into the cool night air. The city was alive with sounds, the distant hum of traffic, the laughter of people walking by, the siren of a faraway ambulance. These sounds, which had once seemed like a distraction from her music, now felt like a part of it. She was no longer the girl who was hiding from the world in a practice room. She was a musician, and the world was her symphony. She began to walk, not towards her dorm, but just out into the city with no particular destination in mind. She had faced an impossible challenge and had not only survived, but had discovered a part of herself she never knew existed. The impossible piece had not been a test of her skill, but a journey to her own soul. And she had nailed it perfectly.